I'm the Voter Service Chair of the League of Women Voters of Golden Valley. On behalf of our league and our co-sponsors, League of Women Voters Crystal New Hope East Plymouth, Minnesota State Bar Association, and National Council of Jewish Women Minnesota, I welcome the candidates, our audience members here, and those viewing us from home. The sponsors are holding this forum for voters to meet the candidates and to compare and contrast their ideas. The rules and procedures for tonight's forum are in the program and were communicated to all of the candidates. The League of Women Voters is a 99-year-old nonpartisan organization that does not support or oppose candidates or political parties. The League encourages its members and all people to be involved in the political process. We encourage informed and active participation in government. Tonight's forum is being video recorded and shown live by CCX Media. We ask our audience here to please quietly listen to the forum and to silence your phones. The video recording will be on ccxmedia.org in the next couple of days. The views expressed tonight are those of the candidates and not those of the League of Women Voters or any other forum sponsors. I'm pleased to introduce Marty Mix, who will be our moderator tonight. Marty Mix is the president of the League of Women Voters of Golden Valley and also the State League president. Thank you, Marty, for volunteering to moderate this forum. Please, would you all join me in welcoming Marty Mix to our forum?
Thank you very much. Tonight's forum has two parts. The first is for the Judge Seat 2 Court of Appeals, and it will last for approximately 30 minutes, followed by a very short break, and then the forum for the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court Seat 2. We invited all the candidates who filed, and we are grateful they all came. The candidates are seated in alphabetical order, and they'll be taking turns being the first to answer the questions. The format begins with the candidates responding to a question we sent them earlier by the League of Women Voters of Golden Valley. That will be followed by written questions from the audience. Finally, there will be 1-minute closing statements. So please raise your hand to request a question card or turn one in to a league usher. We have a couple standing in the back there to collect those. We'll ask as many questions as time allows, consolidating by issue if necessary by league volunteers at the question sorting table, and all candidates will be given the opportunity to answer each question. The choice of questions will be made by me in a good faith effort to reflect the interests expressed by this audience. Please remember that while respectful disagreement with the candidate's position is fine, personal attacks are not allowed. If your questions were not answered, please talk to the candidates after the forum. And please note, we cannot ask a judicial candidate how they would rule in a particular case. So that's a no-no. The Minnesota Court of Appeals, which began in 1983, provides Minnesotans with prompt and deliberate review of all final decisions of the trial courts, state agencies, and local governments. I was wondering why they said prompt. It's because we have the shortest deadline for Court of Appeals to issue their opinions. They have 90 days. It's the shortest in the nation. As the error-correcting court, meaning it determines whether there are legal errors made by the lower court, the Court of Appeals handles most of the appeals, which allows the Minnesota Supreme Court to spend time resolving difficult constitutional and public policy cases. The Court of Appeals decisions are the final ruling in about 95% of the up to 2,400 appeals every year. Typically, about 5% of the court's decisions are accepted by the Minnesota Supreme Court for further review. The court reviews appeals in a timely manner. By law, the court must issue a decision within 90 days of oral arguments. As part of the court's effort to expedite justice and to make access to the appellate system less burdensome and expensive, the court's 19 judges sit on 3-judge panels and travel to locations throughout Minnesota to hear oral arguments. Panels may decide the cases immediately following oral arguments. Their terms are for 6 years, and they stand for election in a nonpartisan ballot. And for those of you wondering why it seems like most of the judges are first appointed by the governor, it's because Minnesota has a law that all judges have to retire when they turn 70. So when they turn 70, that's when the governor has to appoint a person to fill that position. And then they can serve out that term, and then they have to run. The candidates for Judge Court of Appeals Seat 2 are Anthony L. Brown and Lucinda Ellen Jessen. Please join me in welcoming them. Now, each candidate has the same amount of time to respond. The timekeepers are up front there. They will be showing you a card that says 15 seconds when there's 15 seconds left, and then there'll be a stop. And at that point, please finish your sentence, and then I will interrupt. So the opening question is, why are you running for the Minnesota Court of Appeals, and what are your qualifications? You have 2 minutes, and the first candidate to speak will be Anthony Brown.
Well, good afternoon. Good evening, rather. I'm very grateful that you all have taken time out of your life to be here with us to hear about an obscure judicial race, right? The Court of Appeals. I doubt that many Minnesotans are even aware that there's this intermediate court that makes these decisions. I'm running for the Court of Appeals because I truly love the law. I do. And I've seen how the law can impact the lives of everyday people, Minnesotans and across the country. I'm running for the job because I think I'd be good at it. I love reading the law, I love writing about the law. And I'm running for the Court of Appeals because there is to my view, a need for the Court of Appeals to have someone with my experience on the court. I've practiced in civil law, I practice in criminal law, I practice in state court, I practice in federal court, I practice doing trials before juries, and I've argued before federal courts across the country, the state appellate courts here in Minnesota, including the Minnesota Supreme Court, and I've even practiced before the U.S. Supreme Court. I'm committed to justice, and I don't think that we should, during the course of this discussion, leave that out there as a soft word that anyone, what judge is against justice, right? I think it's time that we put some understanding around what that means and what that means to me. And I'm happy to share that with you tonight and answer questions. I'm really here to listen, but I'll tell you during the course of this discussion, I'm going to be incredibly frank with you. Minnesota's judicial system is not perfect. As much pride as we can have in the system that we have, it's got a lot of broken parts. And I'm going to talk about some of those, not to be critical, but to be honest and to let you know why you should vote for me and what my intent is toward working toward those issues. So I appreciate your time and thank you for coming.
Thank you. We'll now hear from Lucinda Jessen.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you to the League and all the co-sponsors and all of you for being here. I'm a judge on the Minnesota Court of Appeals, and I'm up for election this year. You know, I've spent the majority of my life in public service, and I've been in public service because I want to improve the lives of Minnesotans. And I've done that from different jobs, deputy county attorney, deputy attorney general, commissioner of human services. But let me tell you, you're not going to be able to make progress with people's lives without a solid justice system. It's fundamental. And the Court of Appeals is an important part of that justice system. We have about 2,000 filings every year, and we see the breadth of issues that face Minnesotans, from criminal and civil and family cases and child protection cases. Our cases, our decisions touch the lives of so many Minnesotans. And I have the experience, and I think this experience has been really helpful, my experiences in my 2.5 years in the court. First of all, my legal experience. And I think that's what the Judicial Selection Commission looked at when they recommended me to the governor. It's a merit-based system. Because I have done a lot, practiced in a lot of different areas. Big firms, small firms. I've represented people against governments and against businesses. And I've represented governments and businesses. I've done plaintiffs in defense. And those experiences have served me well. But the other experiences that have served me well and I think are also important are the experiences with Minnesotans from all parts of our state, in all walks of life. Because if we don't understand the circumstances of the people who come before us, how can we do justice? And I've done that certainly in my work at the Department of Human Services, where our programs touch the lives of over 1 million Minnesotans, mostly the most vulnerable, every year. But also in my community service that I do every week. So I'm happy to answer your questions tonight, and I look forward to the discussion, and I ask for your support.
Thank you. We'll now begin the question and answer period. And the first question, and you have 1.5 minutes to answer it. Can you describe your experience arguing cases in front of the Court of Appeals or Supreme Court? And we will begin with Lucinda Jessen.
Yes. So my experience arguing cases in the Court of Appeals and the Minnesota Supreme Court mostly dates back in the 1980s and 1990s. I was in private practice. I was in a large law firm in downtown Minneapolis. I had a number of cases in front of the Court of Appeals, only one in front of the Supreme Court during that time. But then I was in the Minnesota Attorney General's office where I had, I don't remember the number, but, some more than 20 cases in front of the Court of Appeals and, and as well as several cases in front of the Minnesota Supreme Court. So I bring that experience as also, obviously, the last year and a half to 2.5 years as being a judge. To bring a lot of appellate experience to this job.
Thank you. Anthony Brown.
Well, I recently argued a case before the Minnesota Supreme Court, maybe a couple of months ago, and if you want to watch that argument, it's available on the court's website. I've argued before the Court of Appeals on numerous occasions. And here's what I'll say. When I go to the Court of Appeals, I'm usually representing someone who's poor, who doesn't have money, well, that's usually who I'm representing. Now, I've represented corporations in federal courts of appeals. That's a different ballgame. And I think every day I know when I walk into an appellate court and frankly in a trial court, if my client isn't moneyed, that I'm the underdog. And I shouldn't say me. Sometimes maybe lawyers take it too personal. It's hard not to get connected to a case. But my client is the underdog. The rules are stacked against them, particularly criminal defendants in the state of Minnesota. And that's a real problem for me. And that's something that, listen, no one wants a rapist or a murderer walking free. I live in the same streets as the judges that are making the decisions. But I have found that the appellate courts, and again, I told you I'd be honest, I think they are quick to too fast to dismiss the claims of those who are not in a powerful position. And I've seen it firsthand, and I want to change it.
Thank you. The next question is increased distrust of government and our legal system is being expressed. Do you agree there is a basis for this point of view? What would you do as a justice to address this concern? And we will begin with Anthony Brown.
I think transparency. I think transparency is the most important thing that the government can offer its citizens, and then you can make a choice. And this is why I think this election is important. I think the Star Tribune reported that this is the first judicial election for a Court of Appeals seat in 10 years. Now, that's not right. And that's in large part because lawyers are afraid to challenge incumbents. They're worried, not necessarily about retaliation, although I imagine some are. I'm not particularly worried about retaliation from my opponent. But, you don't want to face down a judge that you might have to see again. No one wants to stop their practice. It's an incredible burden in some ways. But this is what I've chosen to do because I think that the choice so that we can have these discussions in open forums like this about what it means to be just, what it means to be fair. I mean, that's really what we're talking about. And I think when it comes particularly to the judicial branch, we all know why the legislative system is messed up. You don't need my help on that. But when it comes to the judicial branch, one of the things that I'm concerned about is the lack of judicial elections. Now, you may not like judicial elections, and I get part of that, but it's what the Minnesota Constitution requires. Not yet? Okay. It's what the Minnesota Constitution requires, and we don't see them in the state. And there's a reason for that. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on in a different portion of, hopefully I'll get a question about that. But there's a reason that we don't have judicial elections in Minnesota.
Thank you. Lucinda Jessen, same question. Do you want me to read it again?
I think I've got it.
Okay.
I am concerned about the increasing distrust of government. I saw some polls recently. Now, the good news, I think, for those of us in the judicial branch is people have more faith in the judicial branch, considerably more, than in the executive and legislative branches. But there's been a decline. I saw a Gallup poll, it's nationally, There's a decline from 1997 to 2016 of almost 10%. Only 60% of the people have real faith in the judicial system. So that's something we need to address. And how do we do, though, may I say, as I said, still better than the other branches of government. How do we do that? Well, I think, for one thing, judges need to be out involved in the community. We need to understand what is going on. We can't live in an ivory tower. And I've made that just a cornerstone of my public service, including when I'm on the Court of Appeals. But also, so we need to understand the lives of people, and we need to hear from them, not just talk at them. We do need to be, I agree, transparent. That's why on my website, on my campaign website, I just put all of my decisions out there. Lawyers get access to those. I want everyone to be able to read and understand what I wrote. You may agree, you may not, but that's the sort of transparency we need. And we're doing more of that in the judicial system. Now we're starting putting all of our oral arguments, the Court of Appeals, out online. The Supreme Court's doing webcasts. We can do more, but we're starting a lot. But the main thing, we do not want partisan elections. We want neutral, merit-based selection of judges. That's what I hear loud and clear. And I think that is really an important way to make sure that we don't have an increased distrust of government, of our
Thank you.
judges.
The next question is everyone equal before the law? Why or why not? And we begin with Lucinda Jessen.
Well, everyone should be absolutely equal before the law. And I think when people come before us, we do our best. Judges sometimes make mistakes, there's no question, to treat people equally. But I do think there's some things that stand in the way that we as a society need to address. For people who are poor, they have a harder time hiring lawyers. We have a really good, strong public defense system in this state. So if you're accused of a crime, you get a public defender. But sometimes they're not adequately paid and have heavy caseloads. We need to address that as a state. And on the civil side, legal aid does a great job, but they can't meet the needs. We really need to do more to provide attorneys so that people have access, real access to our justice system, because that is important to make sure that people are treated fairly.
Thank you. Anthony Brown, same question.
No, absolutely not. And if we search ourselves and be honest with ourselves, we won't have a hard time getting to that conclusion. No. Judge Jessen mentioned the public defense system. I work in it, okay? And you would be horrified if your loved ones, this is not at all a comment on the work that my colleagues attempt to do, but if they had to work under the lack of resources, the time crunch, the overwhelming power of the government, both state and federal, in criminal cases, absolutely not. And you would be petrified if you had to switch skins with me and walk into a courthouse, even wearing this suit. Sometimes when I go in the courthouse, you know what they say to me? Have you checked in with the public defender yet? My agent attorney friends are asked, are you the interpreter for this case? So absolutely not. And I think it's important that we stop pretending that we are. Face the issue. If you are a person of color, or if you are poor, living in rural Minnesota, you are behind the 8 ball when it comes to criminal cases. And it is the same when you're talking about civil cases. The government comes and says to you, we're going to take your child because we believe you're not a good parent. Watch out. And it's judges that are making those decisions. So no.
Thank you. The next question will begin with Anthony Brown. How do you balance being, or how would you balance being an independent judge and an elected official?
Well, that's not a problem judges ordinarily have because they rarely stand for election. I mean, if you look at the ballot over the last couple of decades, there are 97 judicial elections on the statewide ballot. You won't see 97 judges on yours, don't worry. But statewide, there are 97. 7 are challenged. And so judges, in all candor, really, I don't think they worry about it, but they know the likelihood of actually being challenged is something that's pretty small. Balancing that, you know what I say? Listen, I got a great life, okay? I like helping the people I help. If I make a decision that you don't like, you don't think is worthy of me being on the bench, vote me out. It's that simple. I think the independence comes from not being tied to the power of the job. The worst thing that can happen to a judicial, a judge who loses an election is they go off and they practice law. That's still a pretty good life last time I checked. And so the independence comes from the fear of not losing the job. And too many judges fear losing the job, which I can't quite understand, given the fact that very few of them are ever challenged. And so I don't think the independence and the being an elected official is going to be a problem. And you know, get out there and talk to the community. Get out there and talk to the people that will live with your decision, so that you can get a sense of what's important to them.
Thank you. Lucinda Jessen, same question.
So I think when we look at that balance between being an elected official and a judge, I mean, I do agree that we need to be out talking to the community and understanding how the justice system is working in people's lives and understanding the situation of the people who come before us. That is really important. And that also, I think, instills confidence and hopefully improves, by listening to folks, our judicial system. But we can't be taking votes on our fundamental rights. We have a Constitution with fundamental rights, and even if most people who would vote for us don't agree with some of those rights, we still have to uphold the Constitution at the end of the day. So there is an important balance, and it's important to realize that even if people vote against you, even if they vote you out of office, it's our duty, my duty as a judge, to uphold the constitutions of Minnesota and the United States of America. And that's just not something as a judge that you can sacrifice for electoral politics.
Thank you. The next question, and we'll begin with Lucinda Jessen. Who are your judicial role models? Please explain.
So my first one's probably pretty, role model is a pretty personal one. So my dad was a lawyer and a judge in Arkansas when I was growing up. And I saw him really fight for people, for the right thing, for justice as a lawyer. He was only a judge for a couple of years, and I watched him as Chief Justice fill that role as well. And I grew up in the South in the civil rights movement, and I saw my dad and other lawyers take on causes that were tough, and I saw judges that did the right thing sometimes and judges that didn't sometimes, and get overturned, often, not always. So I think certainly my dad was my first and best role model. I think here in our state, we just have a number of great judges and justices to choose from. I had the opportunity to work with Kathleen Blatz, who was Chief Justice of the Minnesota Supreme Court for a time, and has held many other roles. And she has always been a role model. And I think one of the things that stood out to me, and she's a co-chair of my campaign, honorary co-chair, one of the things that stood out to me was how she thought about children in the court system. Kids who are in foster care, kids who are at risk of being put in foster care. What happens to these children who are sometimes abused and neglected, but they still love their moms and dads. Their moms and dads still love me. She really helped us do a better job. We can still do better with those kids. That's a sort of role model I think many of us have.
Thank you. Anthony Brown.
You know, I can mention some judges, but I don't think you know them all. And that's not to be a slight, but some of them are obscure. I'm a big fan of Judge Posner, who's a former judge on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. I think he's a brilliant jurist. I don't always agree with his opinions. But a more personal one for me would be Judge Michael Davis, who was the first black federal judge in the state of Minnesota. I had the honor of working for him as his law clerk and being in chambers and seeing how he worked through decisions that affected people's lives, from a farmer upset about a tomato falling off a truck and who's going to pay for that under some obscure federal law, to a consumer upset about a credit dispute under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, to sending a young man to prison, particularly at a time when the sentencing guidelines were not advisory, but he was forced to impose some very tough sentences. And what I can say about that experience is that it certainly taught me that a judge can make a difference, that it's not this robotic process of applying the law. Let's be candid. The law is sometimes what the judge says it is. and that is often the case. And if the judge says, I think you need to go away for 30 years, that's the law. And if a judge says, I think there's a chance for you, I think there's a chance that you can do better, that's the law. And so he showed me, sometimes I didn't agree with what he did, but he wore the robe, so we did what he said. But I learned from him that you can make a difference as a judge.
Thank you. The next question will be for Anthony Brown. Do you believe the composition of juries adequately and fairly reflects society at large? Why or why not?
No. Absolutely not. And there have been too many times when I'm sitting in a trial court with a client, a person of color, and they look over at me and they say, jury of my peers, when will they arrive? And I think one of the reasons why we don't have greater diversity, and here's why it matters. Listen, let's not just talk about race in a vacuum. It matters because I have a different experience in some parts of my life than you have, and you have one different than me. And the idea is that you want a panel of people with a wide variety of experiences. You know, it's particularly in Ramsey County, sometimes I sit there and half the people are from Roseville, and my client is from University Avenue. That's a bad match because they can't quite understand why someone would not call the police right away. Because in their experience with the police, they're getting cats out of trees, right? But in the guy on University Avenue, he may have a completely different experience, right or wrong. And so when I sit there and look at a jury, here's a solution. I don't think it's a judicial solution, but I think it would greatly benefit, since we're rolling out this new ID, let everyone get on the voter registration. That increases the voter, the diversity in the pool of those who will sit as jurors. Compensate people. You know, sometimes it's difficult to take 2 weeks off of your job and get paid $15 a day for jury duty. That's just ridiculous. And it's actually hurting those who need to serve the most.
Thank you. Lucinda Jessen.
I'm a great believer in the jury system. I tried a lot of jury trials. I truly believe in the jury system, but we do need juries that really represent our society at large. And they don't always. Now let's just, state court jurors are pulled from the communities in which they live. But they don't all always show up. And I don't see this as just one end of the spectrum or not. We have, you know, maybe there are people who are concerned, or maybe they, you know, have jobs in the juror per diem isn't enough. But we also have people, and I've seen this myself, who are like, I'm too busy to serve on a jury. I'm too important to serve on a jury. I think we really need to start out looking at education from an early age about the importance of juries, and to make people understand this is an important part of being part of our society, and the role jurors play, and the role we can all play as jurors. We need to start talking to kids as young children about that. We need to spread the word through our civic organizations, because that is a challenge, and it's one we really need to meet.
Thank you. The next question, how does a judge make a decision regarding a new and evolving area of law, such as ones dealing with social media or new technologies? Lucinda Jessen.
So this is something on the Court of Appeals as a judge that we face a lot. You know, you heard the description of the Court of Appeals as an error-correcting court. But those tough issues, those when someone's challenging a statute or bringing a new constitutional challenge, most of those come to our court first. Some of them go on to the Minnesota Supreme Court, but not all of them. But we have to look at those exact issues. And I've had some cases where I've looked and said, okay, we've got these decades and centuries-old laws and our Constitution, and this new technology, how does that work? We need to go back to the values that underlie our Constitution. When we're talking about being free from unreasonable search and seizures, let's think about what that means. You know, there weren't cell phones when the founders talked about that in our Bill of Rights, but that's a value, and we need to figure out how that value, how we apply that. We can look to other states, we can look to precedent, but sometimes we have to make those decisions, you know, without that guidance, where we're talking about something that is new. And we have to go back to the values that underlie our Constitution.
Thank you. Anthony Brown.
I agree that courts are constantly facing new factual scenarios for kind of, old principles, Fourth Amendment, and how technology has affected that, the way technology has affected privacy. But this is where I think when we start talking about what's just and what's fair, and what I mean when I say that, I think you definitely go back to what the law says, but the law obviously doesn't give you the answer. And so now you've got three people on a panel making a decision about what the law should be and what the law will be. As Judge Justin said, those cases come to the Court of Appeals first. The fact of the matter is most of them die there because the Supreme Court's only taking 5%. So it's an important space in which we're making this decision. And to me, I lean on the side of the individual, on freedom, and on restraining government. And I think you ought to know that, because that's the core of how I would make decisions. I don't think that the government is want for power. It's got plenty. And so this isn't to say that this is how we'll rule in any particular case, but when a judge tells you that I'm for justice and fairness and equality and all these marshmallows, okay, ask them what they mean. Ask them what that means to them so you can know what it means for you. Because you may never know. You never know when you may end up in front of that judge. And I'm telling you, as I sit here today, as technology evolves, as things evolve, I am more inclined to protect the individual.
Thank you. Here's our last question, unless somebody else has more questions for us. Have you ever had to make a judgment according to the law which conflicted with your personal values or beliefs? How did you respond? Anthony Brown.
As I said, I do criminal defense work. So yes, there have been plenty of times where I've had to stand next to a defendant and make an argument on behalf of my client, and understand why any reasonable person would question my sanity in making the argument. Try not to make frivolous arguments, but at the end of the day, you have a client. And it's important to that client that they have someone standing next to them that's willing to do it. That's what's great and what's important about the system of justice we have, is that they have that person. I tell my clients sometimes, I'm the only person in the room that will talk to you. Everyone else will talk about you and talk around you. And they live with the consequences of my arguments. But yes, I understand that, it's tough. There's some civil cases that I had and currently have where I'm not a big fan of this particular, issue. But it's important that that person have vindication and that they have representation. The job of a lawyer sometimes in making these kinds of judgment calls is to be the agent, the spokesperson, and I oftentimes say the translator for the people who don't speak this legal jargon, that don't have a Black's Law Dictionary on their shelf. That's our job. And I'm happy to do it. And I think as a judge, yes, there'll be decisions that you have to make because you're bound by Supreme Court precedent or U.S. Supreme Court precedent. Here's the difference. You get to say, I don't agree with this, that this may be the law, but you get to write, here's what the law is, here's what the result will be, but I don't think it's right. And I've seen those decisions, sometimes they're called concurring decisions. I've seen those decisions over time become the majority opinion over time.
Okay, I gave you a few extra seconds to finish it up, and we'll give Lucinda Jessen the same amount of time, about 10 extra seconds. Same question.
Yes, I've issued decisions in cases where the opinions don't reflect my values and beliefs because I'm interpreting often what the law the legislature passed. And if I was in the legislature, I might not have passed those laws. And some of them I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have. But I'm not in the legislature. They get to pass those laws. And if they're clear, then we should be following the legislature's lead on that. I've done that as a judge. I did that as a lawyer, sometimes in the Attorney General's office, where I had cases where the legislature had passed a law and it was my job to go out and defend it. And didn't always think, I thought, I wouldn't have done that. But my job as a judge is not to be the legislature. It's to be a judge. I do agree with Mr. Brown that there are times to say, I have to do this, but I don't agree with it. And I've done that in some of my opinions, where I've either dissented or even where I've said, this is the law, and so we're going to follow it because it's very clear that's what the legislature said to do. I wish they would revisit it, or words to that effect. That this, I think of a couple of unemployment compensation cases I've done. And as I said earlier, my cases, I put them all online so that you don't have to wonder what would she do or what would she say. You can go and read what I've written in those sorts of cases.
Thank you. Well, it's time for closing statements from both candidates. Each candidate has 1 minute, and we will begin with Lucinda Jessen.
Well, first of all, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to the League and all the co-sponsors. These sorts of forums are so important, especially when there's so much going on. I asked for your vote in support, and I've talked about some of my qualifications, but I think those qualifications and those experiences I've had across the state of Minnesota are why so many people who know me and know the judicial system well are supporting me. I'm honored to have Kathleen Blatz and former Chief Justice and Justice Alan Page co-chair my campaign. In a statewide poll by the Bar Association, over 90% of the lawyers voted in support of my candidacy. And just this week, I learned that one of our premier trial lawyer groups also endorsed my candidacy. I'm proud of that because I'm proud to be a lawyer and an active member of the Bar Association and the legal profession in this state. I have been for a long time. People know me, people trust me, people respect me, and I think that's what those endorsements and votes of confidence mean.
Thank you so much. Anthony Brown.
I've gone out of my way to avoid endorsements because I want your vote. And I can put a list of 500 people on a website, and I'm not suggesting this is what Judge Jessen has done. You wouldn't know them. I want you to know me, not the people who are supporting me. I've got my old law school roommate sitting in the back. The system is broken, okay? And soon enough, the secret will get out. That's not to say I couldn't get endorsements, by the way. I just haven't looked for them. But the system's broken, and it's time that the word on that get out. And it's time that you pay attention to the judges that will be making decisions. You know, a judge's job is to make a decision about what happens to people and their property. You need to know who these people are. You need to pay attention to who these people are because you never know when you will end up in front of them. I'm also well-respected, hardworking, smart, thoughtful. I could say more good things about myself, but there's a camera. But I want your vote, and I'll do you justice.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the candidates, the audience here, those at home watching. Thank you to CCX Media, Northwest Community Television for recording this forum. We will take a brief break, then hear from the Associate Justice Supreme Court 2 candidates. But before we get up, let's give a big round of applause for the candidates. Thank you for all your good questions, and we will now talk a little bit about what the Minnesota Supreme Court is. In effect, it's the final arbitrator of the constitutional rights of the people of the state of Minnesota. Supreme Court decisions serve as a precedent for future cases for the Court of Appeals and trial courts in Minnesota. Currently, the Supreme Court reviews petitions in approximately 700 cases a year from the Court of Appeals and accepts doing reviews for about 90 of those cases. They also review Workers' Compensation Court of Appeals, Tax Court, Lawyers' Professional Responsibility Board, and Board of Judicial Standards. Election contests and appeals for first-degree murder cases are automatically appealed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is responsible for the regulation of the practice of law and for judicial and lawyer discipline. It's the rulemaking body for all the state's courts. Each justice is a liaison to a number of Supreme Court boards and other state policy commissions that are charged with responsibilities ranging from day-to-day administration to strategic planning. There are 6 associate justices and 1 chief justice. Their terms are for 6 years, and they stand for election on a nonpartisan ballot. The candidates are Margaret Chudich and Michelle McDonald. Please join me in welcoming them. And just to the candidates, as long as you can see the timer's card, she'll be putting one up at 15 seconds, and then there will be a stop. The opening question is, why are you running for Associate Justice of the Minnesota Supreme Court, seat 2, and what are your qualifications? And you have up to 2 minutes to respond. And the first candidate to speak is Margaret Chudich.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm really pleased to be here tonight to talk with you about the Minnesota Supreme Court and why I'm running to retain this seat. Thanks to the League of Women Voters for sponsoring this event tonight, and thank you to all of you for coming out. I know you're busy people. I've been on the Minnesota Supreme Court now for 2.5 years. I love my job, and as a native Minnesotan, I'm honored to serve the people of the state. The Minnesota Supreme Court, as you heard, is the last stop, really, for Minnesotans seeking justice under our state's Constitution. The work is meaningful and it's challenging, and I'm dedicated to ensuring that all who appear before the court are heard with respect and treated fairly. The Supreme Court hears a wide variety of disputes from all aspects of life, from first-degree murder to First Amendment cases to tax cases. My broad and diverse background with over 30 years of experience in criminal, civil, and administrative law prepares me well to serve effectively on this court. After representing clients on civil matters in private practice for 5 years, I prosecuted violent crimes and white-collar crimes for the federal and state governments. I found my love of appellate law by appearing regularly before the Minnesota Supreme Court and the Court of Appeals in criminal matters. My appellate experience was deepened by 4 years of service on the Court of Appeals. There, I worked with colleagues to decide over 850 cases, and I authored almost 300 opinions. On the Supreme Court, I have authored over 30 majority and dissenting opinions. My broad background and firsthand experience on our appellate court set me apart. I'm passionate about my work, and I seek your vote and support in retaining this seat.
Thank you. Michelle McDonald.
Well, I'm Michelle McDonald, and I'm running for Minnesota Supreme Court. One of the descriptions of the office that was left out is that as your Minnesota Supreme Court Justice, I will be in a position to judge the constitutionality of our laws and judge the judges and their decisions in the lower courts where you reside. For 30 years, I've been an attorney and an advocate for truth, justice, and accountability in our courts. Time and time again, I have stood up to judges on behalf of individuals and families, thousands of them, so that they could earn the basic recognition of their civil and constitutional rights in our society. I'm running for Minnesota Supreme Court because time and time again, as one attorney representing thousands of people across our state, I've witnessed an unprecedented display of courts abusing their discretion and authority, damaging people and families. While raising a family myself, I've consistently worked as an attorney, a mediator, a restorative justice facilitator. I've managed a law firm and contributed my time to legal and community activities. I founded Family Innocence, which is a nonprofit dedicated to keeping families out of court, resolving conflicts and injustices peacefully. I've been a Hennepin County Court judge in small claims court, and I've been a family court referee in Hennepin County, and I've been lead counsel on dozens of appeals, researching briefs for the Minnesota Supreme Court, appearances before the Appellate Court, the Supreme Court, and petitions to the United States Supreme Court of America. Our judicial branch of government should not be the cookie-cutter system that it is. Judges need to look at the particular people and facts and not generalize, because each person, each case has its own DNA. And as your Minnesota Supreme Court Justice, I will protect your fundamental rights by eliminating the bureaucracy and
Thank
making
you.
certain that our Constitution is upheld.
Thank you. We'll begin with the first question. Number 1, describe a situation in which you faced an ethical dilemma and how you resolved it.
Is it Michelle?
I'm sorry, it begins with Michelle McDonald. I had it written down on my.
Well, I resolved it by being ethical. I mean, I've been an attorney for 30 years, and we have our professional rules of responsibility, and they're not being followed regularly by attorneys. Attorneys are going into court, they're testifying for their clients, they're not able to represent their clients effectively. Judges are not calling them out. I think one of the problems that we have here is that attorneys, we need an attorney for everything, and I don't think we should need an attorney for everything. I want to restore a connection between the community and the judges, like connections like we're making here tonight. I think that we should not fear judges as attorneys. We should be completely without fear, and I'm telling you right now, a lot of attorneys fear the judges because they're going to have to do what the judge wants to have happen in the case and not what the attorney thinks that might be fair and equitable. So that is something that I feel very strongly about, that we have to maintain the ethics of the judges, and the judges have to have a much stronger connection to the people of Minnesota and the people that are right before them. I think people are afraid of going into court, and I think that also attorneys are afraid of going into court because it's a very adversary process, and there's not a connection between the attorneys on each side, nor is there a connection to the humanity of the person that's before the courts. I believe that courts have to uphold the rule of law, uphold due process, and due process is not just giving a process, and uphold our Constitution.
Thank you. Margaret Judich.
When I was new as an attorney, I faced a couple ethical issues. One happened in court where I was co-counsel in a case where I noticed, to my shock, that the judge was mouthing to me to object to a question. And I was like, and so I thought that was totally unethical, and so I didn't object to the question. I had another situation when I was a young lawyer when a partner in a law firm that I was working with, we had a little bit of a disagreement on what documents should be produced in what's called discovery, when you exchange information with the opposing counsel. And I was able to prevail upon that partner that I thought that we really needed to produce that specific document. So those were two memorable events from early in my career.
Thank you. And the next question, we'll start with Margaret Judich. How do you avoid being influenced by your political beliefs in a case with political dimension? Can you give an example?
I think this is one of the most important things that a judge does, because when we take our oath to uphold the Constitution, and when we put on that black robe and become part of an institution that is the third branch of government, that's a separate, independent branch of government, we take an oath to put aside our political beliefs to the most that we can. And it's really important because, we are judges for all Minnesotans, and we are sworn to apply the Constitution and the laws. And You know, I have times where I have to sign on to decisions that if you ask Margaret Judicial personally what she thought about it, she would think it's not a just result. But that is the duty of the job.
Thank you. Michelle McDonald.
Well, I just want to say that it's going to be easy. It's going to be easy. We have to start having our judges look at the particulars of the case, look at facts. I pride myself as a forensic fact finder. And what's happening right now is where our judges aren't looking at facts, relevant facts, they're actually just reaching conclusions right off the bat. He harassed her. Well, what does that mean? It's like the marshmallows that Anthony was talking about. So I don't think it's at all hard for judges to do their jobs if they're doing their jobs. Number one, you discern what the relevant facts are. Number two, you apply those facts to the relevant law, and then you reach conclusions, and then you make orders. And a judge's orders are the orders of the case. It's the law of the case what a judge does. There are 5.7 million domestic orders a year across our nation, and that means that each of those families have an order that regulates their family. And this is the type of thing that has to stop.
Thank you. The next question, we'll start with Michelle McDonald. The Supreme Court can only hear a fraction of the cases submitted to it. What types of cases do you feel are the most important for the court to take, and why?
That's really too bad that they can only take a very small percentage of cases. What's really important is they have to start judging our laws. A lot of our laws are not, don't comply with due process. I'm going to give you a quick review of due process. Due process starts with clear laws. Try reading some of the law books, and you ask me if they're clear. Sometimes you can interpret them like Shakespeare. The next step is government adherence to those laws. That means the law enforcement and the police and the prosecutors and the lawyers have to adhere to the rule of law. The third step is a speedy trial. When has that ever happened? Everybody's afraid to go to trial. It's delayed after delayed. Then there's an impartial decision maker. That's the judge. That's a very important aspect. And then we also need adequate legal representation. An adequate lawyer or a representation. It could be a parent that wants to represent their juvenile and say a few words about that person. And then lastly, for our purposes, is an appellate process. And I just want to tell you that if one element of that is corrupted, you do not have due process. Due process is not just giving a process.
Thank you. Margaret Judicial, same question.
Well, under the rules that govern our court, we are to take the most important cases that affect Minnesotans on a statewide basis. And we are to take cases where the Court of Appeals has issued an opinion on the constitutionality of our Minnesota statutes. And we take cases, as you heard the Court of Appeals people talking about, where because of technology or something, it's just an open question about how established precedents would apply to, say, drones, which, you know, have only existed for a short time, or now cell phones, that kind of thing. So those are the types of cases that we take, and we take those cases to try and clarify the law, to try and provide for the district court judges at the basic trial level clear guidance about what the rules of Minnesota are.
Thank you. The next question, we'll start with Margaret Judicial. Whom are your judicial role models and why?
My primary judicial role model was the federal district court judge that I began my career clerking for. Her name was Diana Murphy, And she was a really interesting person. She went to law school when she was 40 years old, and she was the first woman who was ever appointed to the district court, the federal district court in Minnesota, also to the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the intermediate federal court between the district court and the United States Supreme Court. And Judge Murphy was a wonderful mentor to me. I saw firsthand how a good judge runs her courtroom. She was just scrupulously fair. She was kind to people. She asked really good questions of the litigants. She cared about the people who appeared in front of her courtroom. And most importantly, she really taught me how to write a good judicial opinion. I try, we do have legalese, unfortunately, and I try like crazy to get that out of my opinions, because I really want the people who are affected by the opinions to understand that the court really did take your issue carefully. We know how important this matter is to you, and I want you to understand why the court either ruled in your favor or ruled against you without having to have your attorney translate it like it's a foreign language. And I learned that from Judge Murphy.
Thank you. Michelle McDonald, same question?
I've been before hundreds of judges across the state, and I am going to say James Swenson. I had my first family court trial against him before him about 25 years ago, or longer, 30 years ago. And he took us back, the two attorneys back, and explained to us what we had done right and what we had done wrong. The biggest thing he taught me is that these affidavits are hearsay. A lot of people don't understand that, and it's evolved into an affidavit being actual testimony. It's hearsay. That you can cross-examine that affidavit. And then also just to be to not testify for you might know a lot of things about your client, but don't deviate from the affidavit if you're making an argument. Bruce Peterson, I have to mention him. He's retiring this year in Hennepin County. He introduced me to restorative circles, and probably none of you know what restorative practices or restorative circles were, because it was about 25 years into my career. I didn't know either. But he actually had trained with Dominic Barter, a world's peacemaker, and I went out and trained with him as well. And what restorative circles do, and I credit him for it, is you're actually hearing each other. There's not static in the courtroom. You're actually connecting heart to heart. And it's a great process, and I thank Judge Peterson for that.
Thank you. The next question, and we'll start with Michelle McDonald. What are two cornerstones of your judicial philosophy, and why?
I think, first of all, my judicial philosophy is going to be that we have too many laws, and we have to connect with the people. I want to preserve families. I think that all of our laws are set up to break up families, and I'll explain to you why. You could be married. You own a home, you might have it foreclosed on, you have a job, you might lose your job, you have children, you try to educate them, you might have to discipline them once in a while. And there's a big fat book of laws, about 1,000 pages, this is what I mean by unclear laws, that only apply to you if you're going to break up. And that's the deviation. People don't understand why they have to go to court to get a divorce. And I know the history of how that came about, but you shouldn't have to have judges judging your divorces and your families. And that we need to change our laws, and I think that most of our family laws are unconstitutional. We have a fundamental right to raise our family. Fundamental rights are like the air that you breathe. And that is very important to me, and that will be really my primary judicial cornerstone, children and families.
Thank you. Margaret Chudich.
Well, concerning my judicial philosophy, I've spoken about it already. I really come from this that I believe that the court should be open to all, so everybody has a shot at justice in our courts. And I think the process part of that is really important. What I talked about is when people come before the Supreme Court, I want them to feel like their arguments have really been heard, that we've carefully studied it, we've done our homework, we've listened to them, we've asked them questions in a respectful manner, and then when we write our opinions, I want us to do it in a way that, as I said, is accessible to all, that they don't have to take out a legal dictionary to try and determine what we've written about them. So it's a very simple judicial philosophy, but I think that people really, they've done studies that show even when people lose, if they feel like they've been treated fairly, if they've been heard, that they can accept the result. And I think that's how our courts gain people's trust, is by being open, transparent, and clear about what we're doing.
Thank you. The next question is, do you or are you in support of organizations like Isaiah, Take Action Minnesota, et cetera? Are you willing to have these representatives or representations in your courtroom? A brief comment would be helpful. This person participates in immigrant court observations. And we begin with Margaret Judicial.
Well, I think our courts are open to all, so everybody is welcome to come watch the Minnesota Supreme Court. We hear cases the first 2 weeks of the month, the first week in the Capitol courtroom, which is fabulous, and the second week in the Minnesota Judicial Center. And if you can't, and we put out ahead of time what our cases are, we have summaries of them. And if you can't come in person, we live stream the cases so that you can watch us in action. And then we when we issue our decisions, we send them out to the public every Wednesday. So I certainly would welcome representatives of those organizations to our court to observe the process.
Thank you. Michelle McDonald.
Absolutely. I would welcome anyone into our public courtrooms. Our courtrooms are to be public. And I was an advocate of cameras in the courtroom because a lot of people need support from their family when they're going to court, not just from their attorney, but their family. And people have to take time off of work to go and do that support. And I've had dozens of people come to support family members that I've represented and take that extra step. What I have a problem with is the fact that the litigants themselves can't record in their processes. They have to actually pay for very expensive transcripts. And I already know that there is a process for legal transcripts, that's the court of record and that's the official transcript. But I know that attorneys and litigants alike, when they leave the courtroom, they forget what the judge said. I mean, it's so if they could be able to record and actually leave the courtroom, like in other states, you get a little recording of your courtroom, that's helpful. And it's also helpful to have other people there to kind of interpret what is going on in the courtroom. So yes, courtrooms are public places. I welcome more and more organizations and more people to come and watch.
Thank you. The next question, if and how should knowledge of events and society outside of the briefings figure into judicial decision-making? Do you feel that independent research and information gathering by judges and clerks should be a part of the process? And we begin with Michelle McDonald.
I'm going to say no. I wouldn't want somebody Googling some other situation, a judge, and then applying it to my case. It all goes back to individual justice. Individual justice means that the judge is going to pay attention to what's before him. And we all have the same humanity. So it's not that hard to uphold the Constitution in our decisions for everyone. We're just not doing it. So absolutely, positively, I don't think, and it's happening, I'm just telling you it's happening, that judges are actually Googling things, they're actually looking on the internet, they're actually talking to other people about a case that they're looking at, and please, we already have judges that can push buttons. They don't even have to sign their orders anymore and affect and possibly damage individuals and families. So no, we do not want them taking into consideration anything outside of what's before them.
Thank you. Margaret Judich?
I agree that judges and law clerks should not be doing independent investigation. The judges are the neutral parties that people are bringing their best arguments to. And it's a matter of fairness and even due process. If we're looking up things and the parties to the case have no idea what we're looking up, well, that doesn't serve them very well. And they need to be able to respond to issues that come up. So that's why we're really quite firm about not looking at matters, we call it outside the record, because it really is a matter of fairness to the parties. And then in terms of the quality of the court's decisions, sometimes it's tempting to, when you see a legal case, for example, that seems to go in a totally different direction that could apply to the court, it's sometimes tempting to say, why don't we go down that avenue? But we really want adversarial briefings from both sides, so we know that we're not making a mistake when we decide to go down that other path that looks so attractive to us. So I think that it's really important in this age where it's very easy to try and do your own investigations to refrain from doing that, and ultimately that's just not our role.
Thank you. The next question. Do you think that special courts, such as drug courts or veterans courts, have value? Should specialized courts be expanded in Minnesota? Are there other specialized courts you think that should be instituted in Minnesota?
I think it's me, right?
It is.
Yeah,
Yes,
okay.
it's Margaret, it's you. Yes.
Okay, I think that these courts have absolute value. I went to see a drug court recently in Scott County, and it was amazing to me to see all the resources that were gathered around trying to help this person who really has an addiction. And in most cases, we would throw them into prison, and maybe they'd get some treatment, maybe not. But in this case, you have all of the resources of the court trying to encourage that person to kick this habit. Because really, if they kick the habit, they could be living just like you and I, successfully in the community. And I was really impressed with the efforts that went in, and the statistics have shown that these courts are successful. They're not easy. It takes a really persistent effort to work with these people, and there are relapses that they have, but I thought it was really, really the way to go and would ultimately save our society money, and it would help many people get back on track and living successful, happy lives.
Thank you. Michelle McDonald.
I'm going to have to say no to that. I really think that our judges, we need to trust our lower court judges with our particular case. And if there's a criminal case where somebody's doing drugs, that wouldn't be equal justice for all if they go to one judge and it's a specialty court, and then they go to another and it isn't. We have 2 specialty courts in the state of Minnesota. We only have 2 family court specialties. One's in Ramsey County and one's in Hennepin County. Nobody knows that because it's, but our lower court judges are dealing with all issues, civil, criminal, and now they have a new thing called quasi-criminal. Have you heard of that? It's a mixture of criminal and civil. So I think when you go to court, this is what I'm talking about, you want to not fear that judge and have a connection with your judge that's going to help you. We don't need specialty courts to have connections with our judges.
Thank you. The next question, actually, it will be our last question tonight. What role do you think amicus briefs and third parties should play in judicial reasoning and decision-making? This sounds like an attorney-type question, but ask one. And that, we begin with Michelle McDonald.
Thank you. I think they're vital, because an amicus brief, it's a friend of the court brief, the attorney that writes it, and I've written several of them, you get to kind of look at the law across the state and actually be the judge. You're not taking one side or another. You're actually giving the judges information. I just want to tell you a little story about an amicus brief I wrote for Larry Nelson, who I didn't know who he was. I took the case on pro bono, and I wrote it for our Supreme Court, and I spent hours and hours and hours writing that brief, researching every law, leaving no stone unturned. It was about child support, and it was going to the Supreme Court, and it was about, he had been jailed for child support, and I talked about debtor's prison in the brief. And I'm just going to tell you, the attorney that was opposing the case actually wrote a motion to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rejected my brief, said we're not going to have it. So that's the last amicus brief I wrote, and absolutely, positively, we need to hear from attorneys who can actually look at and have a well-rounded decision.
Thank you. Margaret Judich? Same
Well,
question.
I absolutely love getting amicus briefs. The friend of the court briefs are really helpful. Oftentimes, they're from organizations that can help us determine how our decision is going to impact people in the real world. And we're always, I'm always interested in knowing how our decisions are going to affect people. And you can try to think really hard about that, but it's really great when you have input from people who have experience in the areas, who can kind of highlight some of the policy issues that you might want to think about, highlight some of the effects of what this decision might mean. And that's what I love being on the Supreme Court, because we get a lot of these amicus briefs, and I do believe that they help us make the best possible decision.
Thank you. Well, now it's time for closing statements. Each candidate will have 1 minute to conclude, and we will begin with Margaret Judich.
Well, thanks to the League of Women Voters for holding this forum, and to all of you for coming out here tonight. It's great to see this full room. I believe that I've shown through the 299 opinions that I offered on the Court of Appeals and the 33 that I've done so far in the Minnesota Supreme Court that I'm a fair, impartial, and independent judge who scrupulously applies the law to the facts of the case in an even-handed manner without fear or favor. And I'm proud to say that my work has been well received. In the recent Minnesota State Bar Association straw poll on this race, over 95% of the attorneys voted for me. I've been endorsed by the Academy of Certified Trial Lawyers, and I'm very grateful for the support of the 3 former Chief Justices and many former justices of the Supreme Court. They know exactly what this job entails, and they believe that I'm serving the public well. I ask for your support, and I ask for your vote on November 6th. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Michelle
Well,
McDonald.
Thank you. I also want to thank the League of Women Voters and all of you for coming to this event. It is an epic event, and we need to have more connection with our judges, and I really thank you for that. I think bureaucracy is the biggest obstacle to accessing legal help in the legal system, and as a judge in the highest judicial office of our state, I will protect individual fundamental rights by eliminating the bureaucracy and making certain that the Constitution is upheld. And I want to restore faith in the fairness of our judicial branch. It took me 25 years to open my eyes and see that our justice system has evolved into a system of injustice. A colleague of mine, Emily Baxter, wrote a book, "We Are All Criminals." 1 in 4 people have a criminal record. 4 in 4 have criminal history. Then we have appellate court judges rubber stamping orders and stretching for ways to justify rules, laws, and court orders that violate our civil rights. I will protect and defend constitutional rights and make certain that there is oversight and reform of our judicial system.
Thank you to the candidates, the audience here and at home, and CCX Media Northwest Community Television for recording this forum. Before we give the big round of applause, Jackie Wells has a few words to say.
On behalf of the League of Women Voters of Golden Valley, League of Women Voters Crystal New Hope East Plymouth, National Council of Jewish Women Minnesota, and Minnesota State Bar Association, I heartily thank our candidates for the contested seats on the Minnesota Court of Appeals and the Minnesota Supreme Court for answering your questions tonight. And a special thank you to our moderator, Marty Nix of League of Women Voters Golden Valley. We hope this forum has helped the audience here and at home to make an informed decision. We're grateful to the City of Golden Valley for allowing the use of their fabulous council chambers, and we thank CCX Media for recording this forum. Replay dates for the forum are Sunday, October 7 at 7 a.m. In addition, we'll have this forum for the early riser. On the off chance you're not an early riser, how about we'll put it out on it'll be on ccxmedia.org, it'll be on the League Facebook and the League of Women Voters website also, so you don't have to get up early for it. If you're interested in learning more about the League of Women Voters, we've got brochures on the table. We would be delighted to chat with you about our activities and thrilled to have you join us. Please feel free to stay and ask questions of the candidates. As a reminder, early voting is open at Golden Valley City Hall and your City Hall, or early voting location during regular business hours until November 5, plus also on Saturday, November 3. You may also request an absentee ballot be mailed to you. Do that on paper or at mnvotes.org. And remember, Election Day is November 6th. So again, let's please thank our 4 candidates and our moderator. Thank you all.